China will in effect function as a cushion for many of the countries that have been adversely affected by this round of Trump tariffs.
Isn't it now getting very clear that the US is not a reliable partner, not even in trade?
The facade of liberal benevolence has given way to what is in effect an exceptionalist narcissism.
So you are actually interpreting these tariffs as a gift by the United States, a gift in disguise. But can you maybe make that argument?
Yeah, look, the China, of course, has announced a response. It's a 34% tariff on all goods originating from the United States, which is, of course, a reciprocal number for what the United States has levied or announced that it will levy on China out of this particular round of tariffs. The other thing about this, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but the other thing is that over the course of the last week, China's actually announced a range of measures which I think need to be viewed as part of a bundle of things. The Chinese government has announced a prohibition on Chinese companies investing in American companies. China has its commercial regulators have announced an investigation on antitrust grounds of the proposed sale of the Panama Canal ports, and that has caused the owners of the port concessions to defer indefinitely the dealings that they've been having with BlackRock to sell that particular set of concessions. China has also announced overnight an anti-dumping investigation into CT scanning tubes, and last but not least, it's also announced export restrictions on 7 critical minerals and rare earths, together with expanding the list of firms in America that are impacted by these restrictions by adding another 27 firms on the basis that they are potentially involved in the manufacture of dual use technologies, that is, civilian and military use. So China has already responded with a range of measures which, if we're talking about a sort of a Trumpian world of negotiations, it certainly laid down a range of counter issues that need to be negotiated as well. So it's building up the agenda that need to be addressed. I should also mention that overnight we have seen President Trump extend the period for TikTok. So the TikTok ban was to come into effect when on the 19th of January from memory, and he extended that on the basis that it would facilitate negotiations for some kind of a sales transaction. Clearly, that hasn't come to fruition, and President Trump has now had to extend that by another 75 days in the hopes that something might come of those discussions. So there's a lot of issues now on the bilateral negotiation table, which brings us to the 34% tariffs, and ultimately why I argue that it is a gift horse and it should not be looked at in mouth, right? And the reason why is that tariffs, the significant tariff barriers for Chinese-made goods into the United States market will have an impact on the relative price competitiveness of those goods, and they will consequently affect the volumes and then the sales, basically. So Chinese-made products will, I think it's reasonable to say that we can expect them to reduce in sales volumes into the American market. Similarly, the Americans having slapped tariffs on everyone else will also achieve the same effect on a whole bunch of other supplying countries and their companies. Now, there isn't much that America manufactures and which China imports that China can't get from other places. And what I suspect the tariffs actually do, and I'm talking about China's tariff response now, is that they, in effect, create a price signal to Chinese firms and Chinese consumers that will see many of them turn their buying power away from American-made products towards substitute products from other parts of the world. So, in effect, the Chinese marketplace will move from being a destination for American exports to being a destination for European, South American, Canadian, African, etc. exports. to fill the void. So China will in effect function as a cushion for many of the countries that have been adversely affected by this round of Trump tariffs. Now, from a broader strategic point of view, in terms of diversifying trade and ultimately moving towards an international multilateral trading regime where national currencies can play a more important role rather than trade predominantly being denominated in the USD, then this is precisely what needs to happen. And so the opportunity has arisen to accelerate this move towards currency multipolarity and diversifying the global trading network, and in effect, Pascal, decentering the United States. Now, this is a historical trend that's been going on for a while anyway. So the US market now represents a little bit less than 15% of total global imports. It's nowhere near as important as it once was. And that's one of the reasons why the United States in this particular moment does not have the same kind of leverage as perhaps it would have 20 to 25 years ago. So that's what I think is starting to unfold.
But when we now look at the way that also other countries are going to react, I mean, everybody is a bit is still, I think, to a good extent, shocked of how to approach this, how to approach the fact that this beacon of like globalization and free trade and Reagan and Thatcher and the neoliberal consensus under which we've been living for like 40 years, that this is now, I mean, it has been on the back foot for quite a while, but this is a slap in the face of most of everybody who thought, okay, this is how we deal with global trade. Do you think that the that this will significantly impact also the decision-making processes in other countries? Because at the end of the day, the United States has a lot of free trade agreements with a lot of countries, and all of them are now basically, the US tells them like, we do whatever we want. We don't care. we made a new agreement last time with Canada and Mexico, and we don't care about that, right? Isn't it now getting very clear that the US is not a reliable partner, not even in trade?
Well, I think that is becoming increasingly clear, Pascal. The long-standing critique of the liberal international order, of course, has been that the United States can exempt itself from the rules that it imposes on everyone else and can act capriciously. And it is showing just that. So the facade of liberal benevolence has given way to what is in effect an exceptionalist narcissism, and the true colours have been revealed. And if I think that the Prime Minister of Singapore, for example, earlier today or overnight gave a speech in which he basically declared the end of America's role as the central figure in multilateral trade institutions and the culture of multilateral trade that has been part and parcel of the world for the last 50 or 60 years. And that in many ways is saying something that perhaps many have until now been a little bit reluctant to say. How will that affect countries in terms of their own calculations? We're starting to see, of course, a range of responses. The smaller countries and those that have particularly large exposures to the US market are responding in ways that are entirely understandable and predictable, which is they are seeking to have bilateral negotiations with the United States. However, those that don't have as many eggs in that particular basket are now seriously thinking about how they can reinforce bilateral and multilateral trade institutions and strengthen their trading relationships with others, as well as intensify the diversification programs that many have been taking place in any regard. So we see, for instance, that China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea met earlier this week or a few days ago, a little bit before the Trump tariffs were announced, in anticipation of the tariffs, and made it very clear that they will be working hard to improve the trading relationships between those three countries. Similarly, institutions such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the free trade agreement that the 10 ASEAN states, together with China, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, and Australia, have signed up to, I think is going to play an even more important role. Trade amongst these countries, in terms of the intra-regional, inter-RCEP trade, already represents 60% of the trade that these countries undertake anyway. And I would expect that the future supply chain configurations around the world is an intensification of these sort of intra-regional networks, partly because there's the infrastructure to support it, and partly because they can be institutionalized in a context of regional trade agreements, coupled with an ongoing discussion around how that ultimately feeds into a redesign of regional security architectures. Because a change in the global economic order ultimately will impact a global security order. And I think that that is something that we can expect to start to witness going forward. The other interesting trade agreements, I think, that will come into their own, and they'll have some pressure on them, but they'll also be opportunities. Will be things like the CPTPP, which was the legacy of the original TPP, which the Obama administration kicked off, but which the first Trump administration pulled out of, and Biden never jumped back on, and that covers many countries in both North America, Canada in particular, obviously, countries on our side of the Pacific, the Western Pacific, as well as some countries in South America. So these overlapping multilateral trade agreements, I think, are going to come into their own. And obviously, there is still a commitment from many countries in the world to the World Trade Organization, notwithstanding the fact that everybody also knows that the WTO is imperfect in many, many ways, in desperate need of reform in many, many ways. But nonetheless, having come into existence some 20 odd years ago through incredible and long-term investments of diplomatic efforts, it's unlikely that the vast majority of countries are just going to flush those institutions down the toilet. And I say that in large part because the United States is no longer the dominant trading partner in the world. China is the dominant trading partner for 150 plus countries in the world, which means that provided that China remains committed to multilateral trading institutions, it has sufficient heft to give ballast to these institutions, no matter how much under threat they are from the United States, in effect sabotaging the multilateral trading order that the United States gave birth to.